Why was everyone ignoring her at the briefing table? The air inside the Naval Command Training Center was heavy with confidence, the kind that came from scars, victories, and the unspoken arrogance of men who had seen too much to ever doubt themselves again. Rows of uniforms filled the glass-walled briefing room. Sunlight spilled across medals and nameplates, glinting like small reminders of glory. Conversations quieted when the doors opened. Lieutenant Alyssa Reed stepped inside, clipboard in hand, posture straight, eyes calm. She looked out of place among them, too quiet, too composed. There was no swagger, no loud confidence, just that steady stillness that made people uneasy because they couldn't read it. From the front row, Commander Nathan Holt leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, boots propped against the table leg. His grin came slow and easy. "Viper Falcon," he murmured, half under his breath, half for the room to hear. "Sounds like something out of a video game." Laughter rippled across the seats, the kind meant to sound harmless but carried a sting. Boots shifted, elbows nudged. Someone chuckled louder than they should have. Alyssa didn't react. She adjusted the laser pointer in her hand, gaze steady. Behind her, the projector came to life, humming quietly as the map of the Persian Gulf illuminated the wall. Lines of red and green marked aerial routes and convoy paths. She spoke softly, "Good morning, gentlemen." The sound of her voice, calm, level, and deliberate, didn't demand attention. It earned it. She didn't mention her call sign. She didn't correct Holt. She didn't need to. Because Lieutenant Alyssa Reed had learned long ago that silence, when used right, was stronger than any defense. At 33, she carried herself like someone who had already fought every battle that mattered and survived. Her eyes, a cold gray blue, didn't flicker under scrutiny. The kind of eyes that unnerved men used to being the most unshakable in the room. On paper, she was now listed as a civilian liaison, a flight operations specialist. A bureaucratic title, polite, convenient, harmless. It was a reassignment wrapped in courtesy and quiet exile. Once she had flown the A-10 Thunderbolt, the Warthog, the beast that rumbled low across battlefields, its cannon growling defiance into dust and smoke. She knew the shudder of its frame when it took a hit, the vibration of the stick when death was seconds away, the tremor that came not from fear, but from control held at the edge of chaos. Now she was grounded. No one talked about why, not officially. They whispered instead. Some said she froze mid-sortie. Others claimed her aircraft had been hit, that she panicked, pulled out too late and survived by accident. Then there were the darker rumors, that she'd been grounded to make space for someone else's promotion. Whatever the version, it didn't matter. The truth had already been replaced by myth. And Alyssa never corrected any of them. She simply arrived early every morning, hair pulled back, uniform immaculate. She worked from a small corner office overlooking the runways. Her coffee would go cold as she reviewed drone footage line by line, studying flight paths, wind signatures, heat differentials. She had the kind of mind that could see patterns others missed. When teams gathered in the operations bay, she stood near the wall, hands behind her back, silent, observant. She spoke only when necessary. "Check your crossfeed alignment. It's drifting 3 degrees east." Her voice was quiet, certain, and every time she was right. But instead of thanks, she'd get a half shrug or a muttered, "Got it." Then the conversation would move on. To them, Alyssa Reed was competent but uninspiring, the kind of officer who kept the paperwork clean while real soldiers made history. They didn't know that she'd once been history, that she'd once flown through tracer fire and sandstorms, her hands steady while the world burned beneath her wings. At night in her small apartment near the base, the truth waited quietly on a wooden shelf. A single photograph, an A-10 with faded nose art, a black Falcon clutching a coiled Viper. Below it sat a flight helmet, visor scratched, edges sand-worn. A relic, not a trophy. Some nights she would watch old mission footage she wasn't supposed to still have. The room would fill with the echo of engines and gunfire, the rhythm of another life. For a few minutes, she'd let herself feel it again, the weight of the stick, the vibration through her arms, the sound of her own voice cutting through radio static. Crosswind 2, this is Falcon. Hold your line. I've got you covered. Then she'd close the laptop, the light fading to black. And the silence would return. The scars along her forearms, faint, white, thin, caught the light when her sleeves rolled back. She tugged them down quickly, out of habit more than shame. People like Holt wouldn't understand anyway. He was the kind of man who mistook volume for leadership, the kind who led from the front only when cameras were on. And right now, he was leaning back in that glass-walled room, smirking at her call sign, certain he knew who she was. "Viper Falcon," he chuckled again. "You sure you're not just a desk pilot, Lieutenant?" The room erupted in small laughter. She clicked the laser pointer. A red dot blinked on the screen. "Let's begin," she said simply. The laughter faded. Because the moment she spoke, something shifted, a quiet gravity that demanded focus. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her words carried the discipline of someone who'd been obeyed before. But they didn't know that. Not yet. That night in the quiet of her apartment, Alyssa replayed the day in her mind. The looks, the laughter, the way Holt had leaned forward, enjoying the power of public mockery. She wasn't angry, just tired. The kind of tired that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from carrying the weight of your own truth in a room full of people who will never ask for it. She opened her drawer and pulled out the letter she kept hidden beneath old files. The paper was creased, the ink faded but clear. "For extraordinary courage and service under direct threat. We thank you on behalf of a grateful nation." It was signed in black ink, the president's name at the bottom. Alyssa stared at it for a long time, not with pride but with the quiet ache of memory. Then she folded it again and tucked it away. Some truths were too heavy to carry in daylight. The next morning, the simulation room buzzed with energy. Screens glowed blue. Voices filled the air. The usual confidence hung thick, that unspoken, were the best that came from years of drills and a lack of failure. Alyssa stood near the wall again, clipboard in hand, silent observer. Commander Holt's voice boomed across the room. "All right, team. Let's see what our new analyst here cooked up for us. Maybe she'll tell us what makes her little Falcon system so deadly, huh?" Laughter again. Alyssa just nodded once. "I'd like to demonstrate an interference reduction overlay. It isolates signal overlap in real time to prevent comm loss during air-ground coordination." Her explanation was calm, clear. But Holt waved it off. "Appreciate the input, Lieutenant, but we'll keep it realistic today." A few chuckles followed. Alyssa's voice didn't change. "Without the overlay, your recon team will lose signal within 90 seconds. Holt smirked. "Guess we'll find out, won't we?" He turned toward his console. "Simulation start in 10 seconds. The lights dimmed. Data streamed across the walls, the hum of machines filling the room. 1 minute in, everything froze. Just like she said it would. Drone feeds stalled mid-transmission. The convoy vanished from radar. "Signal loss," someone shouted. Holt slammed his headset down. "God, fine, reset it." No one looked at Alyssa. No one needed to. She simply reached forward and turned off the projector. "Understood, Commander." Her tone wasn't defensive. It was still. And somehow, that silence carried more weight than any argument could have. That night she stayed late at her desk, reviewing logs, calculating latency, not for credit, for clarity, because she knew in combat that kind of failure didn't just end simulations, it ended lives. Outside her window, the airfield lights blinked in rhythm, the same rhythm she'd memorized in another life, when blinking lights meant safe return. She leaned back, eyes unfocused. They didn't know who she really was. Not yet. And as the night stretched on, the faint reflection of the black Falcon and Viper glinted in her window, silent, patient, waiting. Because the world could laugh at her name today. But someday soon, that same name would make the entire room go silent. Why did the commander suddenly go quiet halfway through her demonstration? The next morning, sunlight spilled through the tall windows of the Naval Command Tower, cutting across rows of desks and screens. The air smelled of burnt coffee and overconfidence. The hum of machinery filled the simulation bay, that familiar metallic rhythm of men preparing to prove themselves again. Alyssa Reed stood quietly near the back, reviewing her notes, clipboard tucked beneath her arm, headset resting loosely around her neck. She was calm, unreadable. Across the room, Commander Holt strutted between consoles. A grin stretched across his face like armor. He had the energy of someone who thrived on being seen, the loudest voice in a room that rewarded noise. "All right, gentlemen," he said, his voice echoing across the steel walls. "We're running the convoy coordination again. Same route, same objectives. Let's see if our new system survives contact with the enemy." The word enemy was playful, but his eyes flicked toward her as he said it. A few chuckles followed, the usual. Alyssa didn't respond. She adjusted her screen instead. The Falcon Link overlay pulsed faintly in blue light, its algorithms already calculating communication drift before the simulation had even begun. Holt's voice cut through the room again. "You sure you want to run your little video game software live, Lieutenant? Hate to break it on your first try." She simply replied, "It won't break, sir." Holt smirked, "We'll see." When the simulation began, the tension in the room was thick, unspoken. Screens glowed with tactical readouts, convoy icons crawling across desert grids, drone feeds streaming from multiple angles. For the first 30 seconds, everything ran smooth. Then, just like before, one of the officers frowned. "Feed interference on channel 3. Another voice, "Signal delay spiking, sir." Holt's grin faltered, "Adjust frequency." "Already did," someone replied, still dropping. Then silence. The main convoy icon blinked out. "Lost connection," said a tech near the back. "We're dark." Holt slammed his fist against the console. "What the hell is this?" But before he could finish, Alyssa's calm voice cut through the noise. "Commander, reroute your uplink through auxiliary channel 4. Drop redundancy on your secondary feed." Holt glared. "We're in the middle of a test, Lieutenant." "Exactly," she said softly. "Let's not fail the same way twice." Her fingers moved quickly over her tablet. The room dimmed slightly as her system engaged. Blue overlays spread across the main display, streams of data shifting, adjusting, syncing. And then almost instantly, the feed stabilized. Every drone came back online. Every convoy icon reappeared. Latency dropped from 5 seconds to under 1. The silence that followed was different this time. Not mocking, not loud, just heavy. Holt looked at the screen, then at her. "What did you just do?" Alyssa didn't look up. "Corrected the fault your team missed, sir." He stared for a moment, jaw tight, ego bruised. "You ran that overlay without authorization." "I ran it to save your mission." The words weren't confrontational. They were simple, matter of fact. And somehow that made them sting worse. When the simulation ended, the display read, "Mission success, 0 loss." No one clapped, no one spoke. They just sat there, the weight of silence pressing down. Alyssa turned off the console and gathered her notes. "Recommend integrating Falcon Link for future operations," she said evenly. Then she left the room. Behind her, Holt muttered under his breath, but the men around him didn't join in this time. The usual laughter never came. Something had shifted. That afternoon, the story began to spread through the base. The desk pilot had just corrected a commander mid-simulation and been right. Again. No one said it to her face, but the whispers carried. She's sharp. Yeah, but weirdly calm, you notice. Too calm. The next day, she was summoned to headquarters for a larger demonstration, a briefing attended by officers, strategists, and civilian contractors. The kind of room where reputation was currency and doubt was entertainment. Alyssa stood behind the podium, her posture perfect, her voice steady. This is the Falcon Viper Link, she began. A modular coordination model designed for aerial overwatch, signal isolation, and redundancy synchronization. Holographic projections unfolded behind her, digital aircraft paths intersecting with convoy routes, communication nodes lighting up across the map. She explained the system's logic, how it predicted interference before it happened, how it adapted to changing frequencies under fire. But halfway through her presentation, she noticed something. Half the men weren't even listening. A few scrolled through phones, others leaned back whispering. Why does she use her call sign like that? One said quietly. Falcon Viper, trying to sound cool. The room chuckled. Alyssa paused, just a breath, then continued as if nothing had happened. Her slides advanced, graphs and data unfolding like quiet proof. At the back, Commander Holt was watching, arms crossed, grin half returned. When she finished, there was a scattered, polite clap, the kind that says we were here but not we cared. Appreciate the effort, Lieutenant, Holt said, but we're not here to reinvent the wheel. We've been doing this a long time. Her tone stayed even. Permission to run a live demonstration, sir. The room stilled, a few eyebrows lifted. Holt leaned forward, amused. A demo, right now? Yes, sir. He chuckled. Sure, Falcon, let's see what your PowerPoint can do. Soft laughter rolled through the crowd. Alyssa said nothing. She simply began connecting cables to the central console. The movements were smooth, practiced, the kind of efficiency that comes from muscle memory, not training manuals. Within moments, the drone feed blinked alive. The holographic grid spread across the wall, washing the room in cold blue light. Holt smirked. You know, maybe Kitten Falcon fits better. A few tried to laugh, but it died quickly. Because there was something in her silence, not meekness this time, not restraint, something heavier, controlled. Her fingers danced across the interface. System online, simulation parameters locked. Whenever you're ready, Holt said. Already started, sir. Her voice was soft, but the confidence in it landed like thunder. On the screen, icons began to move, aircraft aligning, ground units syncing, comms pulsing in perfect rhythm. No lag, no overlap, no delay. Falcon Link active, she said quietly, switching control grid to adaptive mode. A tech leaned forward. Sir, that's faster than the baseline. Holt frowned. What do you chain? Alyssa didn't answer. Her eyes stayed fixed on the data. Her hand moved once, light and precise. The display responded instantly. The simulation ran smoother than any had seen before. When it ended, the results appeared in clean green text. Mission success. 0 latency. 0 failure points. No one breathed. The silence that followed was the kind that fills a room when pride meets truth. Holt tried to force a smile. Well, maybe luck's finally on your side, Lieutenant. Alyssa unplugged the cables, calm as ever. Luck had nothing to do with it, sir. Then she looked at him, her tone unchanged. Real operators know the value of precision. No one laughed this time. As she left the room, the echo of her boots against the tile sounded louder than the applause she never got. The door closed behind her, and for a long time no one moved. Holt stared at the blank screen where her simulation had ended. The room was filled with the low hum of cooling fans, and something else. The uncomfortable sound of men realizing they had underestimated someone they didn't understand. When the lights came back on, one of the younger officers whispered, "Sir, who is she?" Holt didn't answer. He didn't know. But for the first time since she'd arrived, he wanted to. Later that night, Alyssa sat alone in her office, the soft glow of her monitor reflecting in her eyes. She typed a quiet note into her report. Demonstration complete. System stable under live conditions. She paused, then added one more line. Further testing recommended under combat simulation. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard before she pressed save. Outside, the base was quiet. She looked through the window, watching the runway lights blink through the mist. That same steady rhythm, the pulse of another memory. In the reflection of the glass, her own face looked older than she remembered. But behind it, faintly glowing on the wall behind her, was the old insignia, the Falcon and the Viper. Once, that name had been whispered over comms in the middle of fire and dust. Now, it was just a file name in a government database. She closed the laptop and leaned back in her chair. The quiet filled the room, thick, familiar, almost comforting. But somewhere deep inside, under layers of composure and silence, something had started to stir again. Not anger, not pride, something far more dangerous. Purpose. Because the men at the briefing might have laughed at her call sign. But soon, they'd remember why it existed. Why did the mechanic stop talking the moment he saw the patch inside her jacket? Morning came heavy over the base, gray clouds rolling across the horizon, wind brushing against the hangar doors with the soft groan of steel and weathered hinges. The smell of jet fuel and rain hung thick in the air. Crews moved like clockwork, shouting over the whine of turbines, the clatter of tools, the barked cadence of orders that filled every corner of the space. Alyssa Reed stood quietly near the control rig, sleeves rolled up, calibrating a drone simulator's guidance relay. Her movements were efficient, precise, unhurried. She didn't bark orders or demand attention. She simply worked. A Marine corporal waited beside her, holding a clipboard. He hesitated for a moment, studying her face, then offered the form for her signature. When she reached to take it, her jacket shifted slightly, hanging open at the seam. The corporal froze. Inside the lining of her flight jacket, half hidden beneath a fold of fabric, was a faded patch of black thread stitched into the shape of a falcon clutching a coiled viper. The edges were frayed, worn with age, the colors dulled by sand and sun. "Ma'am," he said softly, his voice careful, "that patch, that's not standard issue." Alyssa followed his gaze, then looked down. For half a heartbeat, something flickered in her eyes, a faint memory, gone as quickly as it appeared. She reached out, folded the jacket neatly over her arm, and said quietly, "Just an old unit symbol." The corporal blinked. He stopped himself. "That's Task Force Viper Falcon, isn't it?" Her gaze met his, calm, steady, unyielding. "That unit's classified," she said softly, "and it needs to stay that way." He nodded quickly, almost in apology. "Yes, ma'am." But whispers travel faster than silence ever can. By noon, the story had spread through every corridor, every hangar bay, every coffee line and barracks room. The name Viper Falcon rippled through the base like a rumor resurrected from legend. Task Force Viper Falcon, a name half the newer recruits had never heard before, but one the older men recognized instantly. It was whispered in veteran stories about a Black Ops air unit that operated deep behind enemy lines years ago, a ghost formation, officially erased after a mission gone wrong. Some said it was wiped out completely. Others said one pilot made it back. But no one ever confirmed which story was true. And now, apparently, she worked in the operations office, carrying coffee and data sheets, ignored at meetings. That evening, when the hangar lights dimmed and the crews clocked out, Alyssa walked the long corridor toward headquarters. The hallway was lined with memorial plaques, bronze plates glowing faintly under fluorescent light, names carved in perfect rows. Each one a story, each one a silence. Her boots slowed when she reached a familiar section. Her eyes stopped on a single plate. Operation Crosswind. KIA presumed. The name below it made her breath still. Capt. Alyssa Reed. The polished bronze reflected her face, alive and steady, but unrecognized by the world that had written her off. She stood there for a long moment, eyes unfocused. Somewhere far behind her, footsteps echoed, a young lieutenant heading down the hall. He stopped when he saw her. "Ma'am, you okay?" "I'm fine," she said softly, not looking away. He read the plaque, then looked back at her, confused. "Wait, Reed, that's—" She turned slightly toward him. "That was a long time ago." Before he could respond, she walked away, the echo of her steps fading into the stillness. That night the base was quiet. The kind of quiet that feels alive. Through her window, the airfield lights blinked in steady rhythm, green, amber, white, like a heartbeat pulsing against the night. Alyssa sat at her desk, jacket folded neatly beside her. Next to it lay two objects, a pair of worn dog tags and a folded letter. She picked up the tags. The metal was dull, the engraving faint from years of wear. Reed ALYSSAM. U.S. Air Force, Task Force Viper Falcon. She closed her hand around them, the chain cool against her skin. Then she unfolded the letter. Though she didn't need to read it, she'd memorized every word years ago. "For extraordinary courage and service under direct threat, we thank you on behalf of a grateful nation." Signed, the President of the United States. Her thumb brushed the edge of the paper. The sound of distant engines filled the night, a cargo plane lifting off somewhere beyond the runway. Alyssa stared out the window, her reflection framed against the lights. The base saw a quiet officer who ran data and simulations. They didn't see the woman who had once flown through storms so thick the sky looked like fire. They didn't see the pilot who had died on paper, so her squad could live in truth. The world thought Captain Alyssa Reed was gone. Killed in action. Her body never recovered. And for years, that lie had been her shield. But now, whispers had woken ghosts. She set the letter down beside the tags, exhaling slowly. "Not yet," she whispered to herself. Her voice was barely audible, but in the dark it carried like a promise. The next week arrived with rain. Heavy clouds pressed low over the airfield, water streaming down the glass of the operations tower. Inside, the Joint Command Simulation Room hummed with electricity and caffeine. Dozens of officers filled the space, SEALs, Marines, tech specialists. The base's first full-scale exercise since her demonstration. Alyssa had been invited back officially as an observer, unofficially as a test. Commander Holt stood at the front again, leaning against the main console. His tone was lighter this time, but the grin still lingered. "All right, people," he called out. "Let's see if this shiny Falcon system holds up under real pressure, and if it doesn't," his gaze flicked to her, "we'll know who to thank." A few nervous laughs rippled through the room. Alyssa sat near the back, silent, headset hanging loosely around her neck, her eyes tracing the data stream on her monitor. She didn't react, she didn't need to. She'd already learned that silence could be a weapon, sharper than any retort. The simulation began. Convoy icons appeared on the holographic grid, crawling across a virtual desert. Drone feeds streamed in from multiple quadrants. Everything looked steady for a while. Then static. The first feed blinked, then another, then all of them. "Signal lost," a tech shouted. "What do you mean lost?" Holt barked. "Main uplink offline. Relays not responding." Holt turned sharply toward her. "What now, Falcon? You gonna pray over the wires?" A few uneasy laughs. Alyssa didn't flinch. She stood, stepped forward, and crouched beside the console rack. Her fingers brushed through a nest of cables. "The main line, rerouting through the wrong junction," she said quietly. "It's doubling latency." "No one asked for a lecture," Holt snapped. But before he could continue, she unplugged one cable and reconnected it to a smaller port on the side, a line no one had used since the last software update. The screens flickered once, then stabilized. Drone feeds restored, all four. Latency reduction, 5.2 seconds faster than baseline. The room froze. Holt blinked. The operators stared at the screen in disbelief. Alyssa stood, brushing dust from her sleeve. "Communications restored," she said softly, as if it were nothing. Then she added, almost to herself, "Crosswind protocol still works." The words slipped out before she realized it. But they landed like a thunderclap. "Wait," Holt said, frowning. "What did you just call it?" Alyssa hesitated, eyes still on the screen. "Standard uplink patch, sir." "No," said one of the older SEALs, a man with a gray beard and the kind of quiet that comes from seeing too much. "She said crosswind." Holt turned toward him. "What about it?" The man's voice dropped low. "That's not a protocol, that's a mission." The room went still. Everyone knew the name. Few dared to speak it. Operation Crosswind, one of those classified rescue missions buried beneath redacted reports and half-remembered rumors. A nightmare, a convoy stranded deep in hostile territory, dozens of men left for dead after an ambush. Every pilot who tried to reach them had been shot down. Except one. No one ever confirmed who. Until now. Alyssa's fingers moved across the controls again, smooth, sure, instinctive. The simulation obeyed her every motion. Drones repositioned, crossfeeds aligned, ground units synced flawlessly. Holt's voice broke the silence. "Lieutenant Reed," he said slowly, "how do you know those codes?" She didn't look up. "Adjusting grid alignment, sir," she said evenly. "Lieutenant," his tone sharpened, "those aren't standard codes." The older SEAL leaned forward. "Sir," he said quietly, "I've heard that phrasing before during Crosswind. We used those exact callouts." Holt's jaw tightened. "That's impossible. Those records were sealed before half this room enlisted." Alyssa pressed one final command. The simulation ended. The results glowed across the screen. Mission success. 0 casualties. Completion time, 2:47. No one spoke. The hum of cooling fans filled the air, the rain tapping faintly against the windows like static. Then Holt's voice came, lower now. "You were part of that op, weren't you?" Still, she said nothing. Another whisper from the back, "Viper Falcon." The name echoed softly through the room. Every head turned toward her. Alyssa lifted her gaze at last, meeting Holt's eyes calm, unflinching. "Simulation complete, Commander," she said. And in that quiet moment, everyone in that room understood they had no idea who she really was. Why did the entire room fall silent when she finally looked up? The rain had stopped outside, but the storm inside the simulation bay hadn't. The air was thick, too still, too charged. Every monitor glowed faint blue against faces that had gone pale. The word crosswind still lingered in the air, heavier than the humidity outside. Alyssa Reed stood at the center of the room, the faint hum of electronics echoing around her like distant rotors. She just shut down the console, her hands calm, her breathing even. But her silence said more than any briefing ever could. Commander Holt stood a few feet away, staring at her like he was seeing a ghost. Maybe he was. "Those callouts," he said quietly. "Viper 03, Falcon 2, Crosswind support, that's not standard language." Alyssa didn't move. "They were effective, sir." He took a step closer. "Where did you learn them?" Her eyes lifted, steady, unreadable, in the air. A murmur spread through the room. The older SEAL with the gray in his beard exhaled slowly, the sound of memory creeping into his voice. "Sir," he said, his tone almost reverent, "that's her. Those are the exact comm codes from Operation Crosswind." Holt turned sharply toward him. "You can't be serious." The man nodded. "I was in the support convoy. Those were the words we heard right before we made it out alive." Holt's eyes went back to her. "That's impossible. The pilot from Crosswind was killed in action." Alyssa's hand rested on the edge of the console. Her knuckles flexed once, a quiet tremor that passed as quickly as it came. "The record says that," she said softly. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Holt's voice lowered. "Are you telling me you were the one who flew that bird?" She didn't answer. She didn't have to. Because silence, in that moment, said everything. The older SEAL's voice broke it again, this time quieter, almost like confession. "We thought you were gone, ma'am. The dust storm was rolling in. The sky went red. We heard your cannon, then nothing." Alyssa's gaze flicked toward him, then back to Holt. "The storm took the aircraft down," she said. "The official report wasn't wrong. I just didn't stay down." Her tone was so calm it unsettled everyone. No dramatics, no heroism, just fact. The room was frozen. No one knew whether to salute her, question her, or simply stand there in disbelief. Holt's jaw tightened. He wanted to speak, but the words wouldn't come. His authority, his humor, all of it evaporated. "Simulation complete, Commander," she said again, her voice barely above a whisper. Then she turned, walking toward the door. Every pair of eyes followed her. As she reached the threshold, Holt finally found his voice. "Lieutenant Reed." She paused but didn't turn. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" he asked. Alyssa stood in the doorway, one hand on the frame. "Because sometimes," she said quietly, "the record's exactly what it needs to be." And then she left. The door closed with a soft hiss, leaving behind the kind of silence that feels like an open wound. For a long moment, no one moved. The rain started again, tapping gently against the glass. Then one of the younger officers whispered, "She's the reason Crosswind succeeded." Holt didn't respond. He just stared at the black screen where her system had run perfectly. The cursor blinked like a heartbeat. That afternoon, the base changed. It didn't happen all at once. Respect never does, but whispers shifted tone. Where there had been mockery, there was curiosity. Where there had been laughter, there was quiet. In the cafeteria, men lowered their voices when she walked by, not out of disdain this time, but something closer to reverence. In the hangars, mechanics exchanged glances, nodding slightly in her direction without knowing why. Every rumor now started with the same words, "I heard she was the one." But Alyssa didn't acknowledge it. She still arrived before dawn, still reviewed footage line by line, still stood at the edges of rooms. She wasn't interested in being believed, only in doing her job. Still, Holt couldn't let it rest. That night he requested the archived file on Operation Crosswind. The request came back red-flagged. Access restricted, presidential clearance required. He sat alone in his office, the lamp casting long shadows across the wall. Rain streaked the window beside him. He opened an old after-action report instead, the kind of document that survived through whispers and personal logs. He read, "Contact lost at 2:10 hours. Convoy trapped. Air support terminated. One aircraft made final approach under no-comm conditions. Multiple confirmations of GAU-8 cannon fire providing cover. Pilot unconfirmed. Call sign, Viper Falcon." He leaned back, exhaling hard. It didn't make sense until it did. The next morning, Holt was waiting by the observation deck when Alyssa arrived. She slowed slightly at the sight of him, then nodded once. "Commander." "Lieutenant." He stepped aside, gesturing toward the glass overlooking the runways. "Beautiful view," he said quietly. She glanced out. "It's quieter before takeoff." For a moment, neither spoke. Only the sound of distant turbines filled the space. Then Holt said, "I looked up the records." Alyssa didn't react. "Did you?" He nodded. "They're locked tighter than anything I've seen, but I found fragments. Crosswind wasn't a standard mission." Her gaze stayed fixed on the runway. "No, it was." "You went in when the storm was at full strength," he said. "Visibility 0. Enemy fire from both ridges. You had no comms, no backup." She said nothing. He turned toward her. "You saved 43 men, Lieutenant. You got them out." Her voice, when it came, was steady but distant. "Not all of them." Holt swallowed, still more than anyone else could have done. She turned to him then, eyes cold but tired. "You think survival feels like victory, Commander. It doesn't. It feels like debt." Her words hit harder than any reprimand he'd ever received. She straightened her jacket and stepped past him. "We don't need to talk about it." Holt's voice followed her softly. "Maybe not, but the rest of us do." Later that day, he called for a debriefing, mandatory attendance. The same room where they'd laughed at her before now felt smaller, quieter. The lights dimmed as the screen came alive. Alyssa stood at the front, her expression calm as ever. She was reviewing the simulation data, pointing out performance metrics, latency improvements, predictive mapping. Her tone was professional, almost detached. No one interrupted. Then Holt spoke from his seat, his voice low. "Lieutenant Reed." She paused mid-sentence. "Sir." "May I ask what those coordinates are?" Her sleeve had shifted slightly as she moved, revealing a tattoo along her forearm. Black ink shaped like a falcon clutching a viper, with a string of numbers beneath. The room went still again. Alyssa's hand instinctively pulled her sleeve down, but it was too late. Holt rose slowly to his feet. His tone changed, no longer condescending, no longer casual. "I know that tattoo," he said. "My co told me about it years ago." Alyssa didn't move. "He said the pilot who saved them during Crosswind had that mark," Holt continued. "A falcon and a viper. Call sign Viper Falcon." Her breath caught for half a second. She exhaled through her nose, quiet but deliberate. "Crash didn't kill me," she said softly, "just grounded me." Silence absolute. Every man in that room sat frozen, like the air itself had gone heavy with memory. Holt's jaw worked once before words came. "I was there," he said finally. Alyssa blinked, surprised. "I was in that convoy," he continued, voice cracking slightly. "We thought it was over. Dust storm swallowed everything. No visibility, no hope. Then we heard it, your cannon. You came in so low we thought you were part of the sandstorm." Her lips parted, the faintest tremor passing through her. Holt stepped closer. "You stayed until the last man was clear. I never forgot that sound. Every man on that ridge remembers it." Alyssa swallowed hard. "We got lucky that night." Holt shook his head. "No, ma'am, we got you." And for the first time since she'd arrived, her composure faltered. Her eyes softened, the weight she carried flickering into view. Around them, chairs scraped as men stood, one by one, unsure why, only that it felt right. Holt straightened to full height, boots clicking against the floor. He raised his hand in a crisp salute. "Permission to address you properly, Captain Reed," he said firmly. The word captain echoed through the room like a slow drumbeat. Alyssa froze. "I'm not in command anymore, Commander." Holt's salute didn't waver. "Ma'am," he said, voice steady, "you always will be." For a moment, no one breathed. Then every man in the room followed suit, chairs scraping, boots striking, hands rising in unison. No one said a word. The sound of discipline filled the room again, not born from rank or orders, but from respect rediscovered. Alyssa's throat tightened. She looked at each of them, the same men who had once smirked at her name, now standing motionless, eyes locked on her. She wanted to tell them to stop, to sit, to forget, but she couldn't. Because this was bigger than her. The silence that filled the room wasn't awkward, it was sacred. And somewhere deep in that silence, the ghost of Viper Falcon finally breathed again. Why did she look more broken at the moment of honor than at the moment of humiliation? The room was still. No one spoke. No one even shifted. Only the hum of the overhead projectors filled the silence, that faint electric whisper running through the air like memory. Alyssa Reed stood frozen in the center of the room, her sleeve half rolled, the tattoo half visible, the black falcon clutching the coiled viper, inked into skin that had once gripped the throttle of a warplane through sand and fire. Before her, 30 men stood at attention, SEALs, Marines, pilots, and technicians, their boots locked together, their hands raised in salute. At the head of the room, Commander Nathan Holt stood stiff and silent, the man who had once mocked her now the first to honor her. "Permission to address you properly, Captain Reed," he had said. And with those words, the legend she'd tried so long to bury had come roaring back to life. Alyssa looked around the room, her heartbeat steady but her throat tight. She wanted to speak, to tell them not to do this, that she didn't deserve it, that heroes were the ones who hadn't come home. But she couldn't. The faces around her weren't full of pride. They were full of realization. And guilt. Holt's hand was still raised in a perfect salute, but his jaw trembled ever so slightly. His eyes, once sharp with command, were now glassy with something far heavier. Respect, regret, redemption. Alyssa's voice, when it came, was soft but sure. "I'm not in command anymore, Commander." Holt didn't move. "Ma'am," he said, steady now, "you always will be." The weight of those words hit her harder than she expected. It wasn't flattery. It wasn't formality. It was truth, and truth, she'd learned, carried its own burden. She exhaled slowly, forcing her shoulders to relax. "You don't salute ghosts," she said. But no one lowered their hands. Around the table, chairs scraped against tile as more men stood, young officers who had once smirked behind her back now rising to attention, their eyes fixed forward, their postures rigid. Alyssa turned away slightly, overwhelmed. The movement stirred the air, brushing against the old flight helmet that sat on the table beside her. Someone had placed it there earlier like a relic at an altar. The edges were scuffed, the visor scratched, the paint faded but unmistakable. The black falcon gripping the viper. Her hand hovered over it, hesitant, then she touched it. The metal was cold. The contact sent a shiver up her arm, not fear, not pain, memory. She could almost hear the sound again, the guttural roar of her A-10 cannon splitting through sand and wind, drowning out radio screams. The smell of smoke and oil. The taste of iron in her mouth. Crosswind. She saw it in flashes. The convoy pinned in the canyon. Static choking the comms. Dust turning daylight into rust-colored dusk. And her own voice, calm, precise, unshaken, cutting through the noise. "Hold position, I've got your 6. Alyssa blinked and the memory broke. She was back in the briefing room, surrounded by silence and reverence. She looked at Holt, his hand still raised. Her voice wavered. "That mission cost good people more than I'll ever repay." Holt's tone softened, "and it saved even more than you'll ever know." For a long moment, the two simply stood there, the pilot who had been buried by rumor and the commander who had once laughed at her. Then Holt dropped his salute. The others followed, the scrape of boots against tile echoing like thunder in a cathedral. No applause, no noise, just silence. The kind of silence that feels holy. Alyssa nodded once, an acknowledgement not of honor but of understanding, and turned toward the door. But before she could leave, Holt spoke again. "We thought the sky was falling that night," he said quietly. "Dust storm swallowed everything. Convoy pinned, no air support." He hesitated, his voice shaking. "Then we heard it, that cannon. We thought it was the storm itself coming down on us, but it was you." She stopped, her back to him. every muscle in her shoulders tense. "We never forgot that sound," he said. "Not one of us." Her throat tightened. She turned her head just enough that he could see her profile, calm, dignified, but fragile in ways words couldn't touch. "I only did what I had to," she said. Holt shook his head slowly. "No, ma'am, you did what none of us could have done." For a second, the faintest hint of emotion crossed her face, something like sorrow wrapped in peace. Then one of the younger officers stepped forward, the same one who had once whispered jokes about her call sign during her presentation. He carried something in both hands, careful, reverent. It was her old helmet. He set it down gently on the table in front of her, his eyes low. "Found this in storage, ma'am. Figured it belongs to you." Alyssa stared at it, motionless. Her fingers brushed the edge. The visor caught the light just enough for her reflection to appear older, quieter, but still the same woman who had flown through hell and come back breathing. She ran her hand across the paint. The color was chipped, but the symbol still lived, the black falcon gripping the viper. Her reflection flickered on the glass. Two versions of her staring back, the soldier she had been and the survivor she had become. She whispered, barely audible, "Didn't think this thing would ever see daylight again." Holt's voice was quiet. "Some things don't belong in the dark, ma'am." She looked up at him, and for a heartbeat neither wore their ranks. Just two soldiers who understood the same truth, that sometimes survival wasn't a victory, but a sentence. Alyssa straightened, her hand still resting on the helmet. "The mission wasn't about me," she said. "It was about them, the ones who didn't make it back." Holt nodded once. "And because of you, some of us did." The room was silent again. But this silence didn't feel like before. It wasn't the silence of mockery or disbelief. It was the kind that followed realization. The kind that made men remember what the word duty really meant. The narrator's voice, if one had been there to speak it, would have softened. Respect doesn't always come from medals. Sometimes it comes from the sound of boots hitting the ground. When the men who once laughed at you rise to salute. Alyssa exhaled, slow, steady. For the first time in years, she didn't feel invisible. And yet being seen felt almost unbearable. She lifted the helmet, holding it to her chest for a moment before setting it gently back down. "I appreciate the gesture," she said quietly, "but I'm not a legend, Commander. Just someone who got lucky once." Holt met her gaze. "Luck doesn't fly through fire." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The meeting ended with no ceremony, no orders, just that quiet air of shared understanding. One by one, the officers filed out. Some stopped to nod at her, not out of protocol, but out of gratitude. Holt lingered last. "Before leaving," he said softly, "the men you saved back then, we tell their stories. You deserve to have yours told too." Alyssa looked down at the helmet again, her fingers tracing the scratches along its edge. "Stories have a way of growing, Commander," she said. "Let this one stay where it belongs." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded, understood. When the door closed behind him, the room was empty again. Alyssa stood there alone, the hum of the lights overhead filling the silence. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel it, the quiet weight of all those years pretending to be someone else. She thought about the plaque in the hallway, the name that wasn't supposed to exist anymore. Capt. Alyssa M. Reed, KIA. For years she had lived like a ghost in her own shadow. Now, the world knew she was alive again. She wasn't sure if that was a relief or a burden. Her gaze fell back to the helmet. She whispered, "Guess it's time to stop hiding, huh?" Outside, thunder rolled across the horizon. The sound was distant but deep, like the memory of her engines long ago. She walked to the window, watching lightning flash over the runways, streaking across the night sky in jagged veins of light. Her reflection stared back, composed, calm, but behind her eyes a spark. A spark of something that had been dormant too long. Purpose. The kind that doesn't fade with time, only weights. She reached up, pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders, and turned off the lights. The room went dark except for the faint glint of the Falcon and Viper insignia catching the storm's reflection. And in that quiet dark, one truth settled in her chest, heavy but freeing. She had been mocked, forgotten, and buried by rumor. But she had also been something else. The one who came back. Why did she return to the hangar long after everyone had gone home? The storm had passed, leaving the air damp and cool. Puddles reflected the amber glow of the floodlights that rimmed the runways. The base was asleep now, machines powered down, crew quarters dark, the constant hum of life reduced to silence. Alyssa Reed walked alone across the tarmac, her boots echoing softly against the wet concrete. Her jacket clung lightly to her shoulders, the fabric still smelling faintly of jet fuel and rain. The hangar loomed ahead, tall, cavernous, a hollow monument of steel and ghosts. Its doors stood slightly ajar, letting a thin beam of light spill into the night. She hesitated at the threshold. It had been years since she'd stepped into this hangar alone. Inside, the air was colder, heavy with the scent of oil, metal, and dust. Shadows stretched long beneath the overhead lamps. Rows of old aircraft sat under protective sheets, their outlines ghostly and still. Some of them had been dismantled for parts, others preserved for training or nostalgia. And then there was hers. Tucked near the back, covered in a film of dust, was an old A-10 fuselage, its tail bent, one wing partially dismantled, its cannon long silent. Alyssa walked toward it slowly. Each step seemed to echo through time. The closer she got, the more details emerged, the scratches along the nose, the faded emblem that still clung to the fuselage like stubborn memory, a black falcon gripping a coiled viper. Her call sign. Her ghost. She reached out, brushing her fingers along the cold metal. The texture was rough beneath her palm, scarred by sand and war and time. "You shouldn't be here," came a voice from behind her. Alyssa turned. Commander Holt stood in the doorway, his uniform jacket unbuttoned, sleeves rolled, fatigue in his posture. His tone wasn't reprimand, just quiet observation. "Neither should you," she said softly. He stepped inside, his boots leaving faint prints in the dust. "Couldn't sleep," he admitted. She gave a faint smile. "Happens to the living." He stopped a few feet behind her, looking up at the aircraft. "So that's the bird," he said. "The one they said went down in the storm." "That's the one," she replied. "It looks smaller than I imagined." She nodded. "They always do once you've walked away from them." For a while neither spoke. The quiet hung thick between them, broken only by the distant hum of the airfield generators. Finally Holt asked, "Why did you come back tonight?" Alyssa's fingers lingered on the old paint, tracing the faint outline of the Falcon's wing. "To remember," she said. "Remember what?" "That it happened." He frowned slightly. "You think anyone could forget?" She looked at him, calm, measured. "They forgot me." He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came, because she wasn't wrong. For years, her name had been buried under redacted files and myths. The hero they'd turned into a ghost because the truth didn't fit the story they wanted told. Holt looked at her then, not as a subordinate, not even as an officer, but as something else. A living contradiction to everything he thought he knew about silence and strength. "You ever think about flying again?" he asked quietly. Alyssa's hand dropped to her side. "Every day, but wanting it and needing it are two different things." He nodded slowly. "You could have fought to get reinstated." "I did." Her voice was almost a whisper. "At first. Then I realized I wasn't fighting for the sky. I was fighting to prove something to people who stopped listening a long time ago." Holt leaned against a nearby crate, folding his arms. "And now?" "Now," she said, "I just want peace." The hangar fell silent again. Somewhere above, a loose chain clinked softly against a support beam, a quiet rhythm in the stillness. "You know," Holt said after a while, "when I first met you I thought you were cold, detached, like you didn't care what anyone thought." Alyssa glanced at him, a faint smirk ghosting across her face. "You weren't wrong." He chuckled softly. "No, you cared too much, you just learned to hide it." She looked back at the A-10. The lights glinted off the cockpit glass, dull and cracked but still reflecting her face. "Hiding it kept me alive." "Maybe," he said, "but letting people see it might remind them what kind of strength looks like." She exhaled slowly, her breath visible in the cold air. "Strength isn't about being seen, Commander. It's about still standing when no one's watching." He watched her for a moment, then nodded. "You know, when the men saluted you today, I saw something in their faces I haven't seen in years." "What's that?" "Belief," he said simply. "The kind that's earned, not ordered." Her gaze softened. "They don't owe me that." "Maybe not," he said, "but they needed it, and maybe you did too." The words lingered in the air, soft but true. Alyssa turned back toward the A-10, stepping closer to the nose. Her reflection warped across the scratched glass, the Falcon emblem faintly visible beneath it. She pressed her palm against the cold metal once more, eyes half closed. In her mind the hangar dissolved, the years peeled away. The storm roared. Her cockpit rattled. Warning lights flashed red. The radio screamed with static. And somewhere through the chaos came Holt's younger voice, faint, desperate. "Falcon, do you read? We're pinned, repeat, we're pinned." And her own response, calm through the fire. "Hold on, boys, I'm already on the deck." The cannon thundered. The sky turned orange. Then black. And she remembered the silence that followed. Not the silence of victory, but of loss. She opened her eyes again. The hangar returned, quiet still. Holt stood there, watching her carefully, saying nothing. After a long moment she spoke, voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes, Commander, I think the hardest part isn't surviving, it's living afterward." He nodded slowly. "Then live, that's an order." She smiled faintly. "You don't outrank me, remember." He laughed under his breath. "Fair point." They stood there a moment longer, the ghost of humor easing the weight between them. Then Holt straightened. "You know the base is going to change after this. People talk, word spreads." "I know," she said quietly. "You okay with that?" "I'm okay with the truth," she said. "They can do what they want with the story." Holt studied her face for a moment. "You ever wonder why it took this long for them to see you?" Alyssa tilted her head, thoughtful. "Because I stopped needing to be seen." He nodded, absorbing it. Then, after a pause, "What happens now?" She looked back at the A-10, her reflection ghosted in its canopy. "Now," she said softly, "now I rest, until I'm needed again." Her voice carried no pride, no sorrow, just peace. The kind that comes after too many years of fighting unseen battles. Holt gave a slow nod. "If they ever send up another bird," he said, "I'd trust no one else to fly it." Alyssa smiled faintly. "Careful, Commander, that almost sounds like respect." He chuckled, "Almost." Then he turned toward the door. Before leaving, he looked back once more. "Good night, Captain." "Good night," she said, her voice soft as the rain beginning again outside. When he was gone, Alyssa stood alone in the hangar once more. The lights buzzed quietly overhead, shadows moving across the concrete floor. She reached up and removed the dust cover from the A-10's nose, letting it fall slowly to the ground. For the first time in years, the Falcon and Viper emblem shone clearly under the light. She traced it with her fingertips. "We made it home," she whispered. "That's enough." She placed her hand flat against the metal one last time, then stepped back. The aircraft stood silent but somehow alive again. The narrator's voice would have softened here, letting the weight of the moment breathe. She didn't return to reclaim glory. She returned to remember what it cost. Because sometimes strength doesn't roar, it whispers. It stands in the dark, touches an old scar, and finally lets itself forgive. Alyssa turned toward the exit. The rain outside had slowed to a drizzle. She paused once, looking back over her shoulder at the row of old aircraft, each one a story, each one a silence. Then she walked out, her silhouette framed by the light spilling through the open hangar doors. Her steps were steady, unhurried, and as she disappeared into the night, only the faint glint of the Falcon emblem remained in the darkness. Why did the base feel different the next morning? It wasn't louder or busier. If anything, it was quieter, the kind of quiet that comes when noise is replaced by thought. The story had spread. By sunrise, every corridor hummed with the same whispered question. Was it true? Was Lieutenant Alyssa Reed, the quiet analyst with the calm voice and the unassuming posture, really the ghost pilot from Operation Crosswind? The one who'd been written off as dead, buried in paperwork, and remembered only by rumor. No one asked her directly. They didn't need to. You could see it in how people looked at her now, not with disbelief, but with the kind of searching eyes soldiers get when they realize the legends they grew up hearing aren't just stories. They're standing right in front of them. When Alyssa arrived at the command center that morning, conversations softened as she passed. Men straightened their uniforms. Some nodded silently, others pretended not to notice her, afraid that respect might look too much like guilt. She didn't acknowledge any of it. She just moved through the room with the same calm she always had, coffee in one hand, clipboard in the other, her routine untouched by the world finally catching up to the truth. Only one thing was different. When she reached her desk, the old flight helmet, the one that had been returned to her the day before, was sitting there, cleaned, polished, the Falcon and Viper insignia gleaming faintly under the fluorescent light. Someone had placed it carefully beside her reports, as if returning an heirloom to its rightful owner. She stared at it for a long moment before setting her coffee down. Then, almost reluctantly, she reached out and touched it. The surface was cold, smooth. The scratches along its edge were still there, scars that no polish could erase. In the reflection of the visor, she saw her own face. Calm, composed, but her eyes, they looked tired. A quiet voice came from behind her. "Morning, Captain." She turned. Commander Holt stood there, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. She gave a small smile. "You're early." He shrugged, "Didn't sleep much." "Still thinking about yesterday." He handed her one of the cups, still trying to believe it. Alyssa took the cup, the warmth seeping into her hands. "Belief's a fragile thing, Commander. One truth can shatter a dozen opinions." He chuckled lightly. "You're full of those quiet one-liners, aren't you?" Occupational habit. They stood there for a moment, the hum of computers filling the silence between them. Outside, the morning sun was trying to push through the thin layer of fog that hung over the airfield. Holt leaned against the edge of her desk. "You know, the brass wants to talk to you." "About?" "Your system, the Falcon Link protocol." She raised an eyebrow. "They ignored it for weeks." He smiled faintly. "They're not ignoring it anymore." Alyssa exhaled through her nose, somewhere between amusement and fatigue. "So, let me guess, they want me to teach it to someone else." "Something like that," Holt said. "They want you to lead the integration training for the joint forces, air and ground coordination." She looked at him. "You mean they want me to train the same people who spent the last 3 months laughing at me?" He didn't flinch. "Yeah, pretty much." A long pause, then to his surprise she smiled. "That's poetic, isn't it?" He grinned. "That's military justice for you, too late but better than never." Her smile faded slowly, replaced by something softer. "I'll do it," she said, "but on one condition." "Name it." "No rank, no spotlight, no ceremony. I just want the team to be ready, that's it." Holt nodded. "I'll make it happen." She looked back at the helmet again, her fingers brushing the faded paint. "You ever wonder, Commander," she asked quietly, "how many soldiers are still walking around out there, invisible, the ones who never got the credit because someone higher up needed the medal?" Holt's jaw tightened. "More than we'll ever know." "Then maybe this isn't about me," she said. "Maybe it's about them." He gave a slow nod, thoughtful. "You're the kind of officer they build stories around, you know that." Alyssa looked up, her expression unreadable. Stories fade, discipline doesn't. She picked up her clipboard. "Now let's get to work." For the next several days, the operations floor transformed. What had once been routine drills now became coordinated simulations, joint exercises that merged air and ground operations under her Falcon Link system. At first, the men were awkward around her, unsure how to speak to a living legend. But she treated them the same way she always had, direct, calm, without ego or condescension. "Don't think about impressing me," she told them. "Think about surviving each other." Her tone carried no anger, no bitterness, just focus. And slowly, something began to shift. They started listening. Her voice became the quiet compass of the operation. When she spoke, the room stilled. When she corrected someone, they didn't argue. They adjusted. The first time a full simulation ran without a single signal failure, Holt turned to her with a half grin. "You realize this is the first time the Navy, the Marines, and the Air Force have worked together without stepping on each other's frequencies." She smirked faintly. "So miracles do happen." He laughed. "Maybe it's not a miracle, maybe it's just good leadership." Her eyes flicked toward him. "Good leadership doesn't shout," she said. "It listens." He smiled. "I'll remember that." When the final simulation of the week ended, the results were flawless. 0 latency, 0 errors, 0 losses. Holt gathered the team in the debriefing room. "All right," he said. "Who here thought this system was a waste of time 2 weeks ago?" A few hands rose hesitantly. He pointed toward Alyssa. "Tell her that again." No one spoke. Alyssa looked at them, expression calm but kind. "It's okay," she said softly. "Skepticism keeps you honest. Just don't let pride keep you blind." There was a faint ripple of laughter, genuine this time, not mocking. Holt leaned closer, murmuring just for her to hear. "You realize they'd follow you into a storm right now, don't you?" She glanced at him. "Let's hope they never have to." That evening, when the exercises ended and the others filed out, Holt lingered behind. Alyssa was still at her station, reviewing data. "Long day," he said. She didn't look up. "Good one." He hesitated, then asked quietly, "How does it feel?" She paused, to be respected. He nodded. A faint smile crossed her face. "Strange," she said, "like wearing someone else's uniform." He studied her for a moment. "They see you now, Alyssa." She shut the report and stood. "Seeing isn't the same as understanding, Commander." He tilted his head. "Then what is it?" She met his gaze. "It's remembering." Her words landed softly, but stayed in the air. Later that night, Alyssa returned to her apartment. The lights of the runway blinked through her window, a rhythm she'd come to know as the heartbeat of her second life. She sat at her desk, the old helmet beside her, the dog tags glinting faintly in the low lamplight. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to open the letter again, the one with the presidential signature. Her eyes lingered on the words, "For extraordinary courage in service under direct threat." She exhaled slowly and folded it back up. "Extraordinary courage," she whispered. "They make it sound so clean." She looked out the window at the lights, her voice quiet, almost prayer-like. "Courage isn't clean, it's messy, it shakes, it bleeds, it doubts, but it still shows up." The wind outside picked up, rattling the glass. A faint smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. The narrator's voice, if it had been there, would have softened here, slow, reflective, like the kind of truth you don't tell loudly. She wasn't the kind of hero they wrote speeches about. She was the kind who went back to work the next morning. The kind who didn't need applause to know she'd done something that mattered. Alyssa stood and walked to the window. Beyond the fence, an aircraft taxied into position, lights flickering, engines humming low. She watched it lift off, disappearing into the fog until only the sound remained. She whispered, "Fly safe." Then, after a pause, she added softly, "Bring them home." It wasn't a prayer. It was a memory turned into a command, a ritual born from everything she'd lost and everything she'd learned to let go. As the night deepened, the lights along the runway blinked in steady rhythm, like a code she'd written long ago and never forgotten. For the first time in years, the quiet didn't feel empty. It felt earned. Why did she stand on the runway that night, long after every engine had gone silent? The air was cold, brushed with salt from the nearby sea. The wind moved across the concrete like a whisper, steady, patient, carrying memories instead of noise. Alyssa Reed stood alone beneath the floodlights, the black silhouette of her jacket cutting against the pale glow. Her hair fluttered lightly across her face as she looked out over the empty field. Rows of aircraft slept in stillness, steel wings folded, canopies sealed, instruments dark. She wasn't supposed to be here anymore. Her shift had ended hours ago. The reports were filed. The work was done. But something inside her hadn't settled, not yet. Alyssa crouched slowly, running her fingers along a line in the concrete, the faint scar where her A-10's landing gear had once struck during an emergency descent years ago. She made it back that night, barely. She remembered the jolt, the sparks, the metal screaming beneath her, the way the earth had rushed up to meet her like an old friend. She smiled faintly. "Still here," she whispered to the ground. Behind her, soft footsteps approached. "Commander Holt again." She didn't turn. "Figured I'd find you out here," he said. She nodded once, couldn't sleep. He came to stand beside her, hands in his pockets. "You've been saying that a lot lately." "Habit," she said. "War trains you to listen for what isn't there." They stood together in silence for a moment, the sound of wind and distant waves their only company. "You know," Holt said quietly, "since yesterday recruitment been flooded. Young pilots asking to join the same unit you're attached to. Word spreading." Alyssa didn't look at him. "It's not my story they should chase." "Maybe not," he said, "but it's your example." She exhaled slowly. "I never wanted to be an example, Commander. I just wanted to be useful." He smiled faintly. "That's exactly why you are one." For a long moment, neither spoke. The hum of a faraway generator rolled across the airfield, low and even. Finally, Holt said, "They're planning to decommission this hangar. The old birds are getting transferred." Alyssa turned toward him, "Including mine." He nodded. "Yeah, they'll move it to the museum outside Langley. Flight 9 Viper Falcon. They'll even repaint the emblem." Her gaze drifted back toward the hangar. "It's strange," she murmured. "You survive something just to watch it be put behind glass." "Maybe that's not an ending," he said. "Maybe it's how stories stay alive." She didn't answer. Her eyes lingered on the horizon, the faint blush of dawn just beginning to edge against the darkness. "I read your file again," Holt said after a pause. "The official one. It ends with a single line, 'Pilot presumed KIA, body unrecovered.'" Alyssa smirked softly. "They weren't wrong." He frowned. "What do you mean?" "I did die that night, Commander. Maybe not my body, but the part of me that believed war had clean lines and clear endings." Her voice was calm, too calm. The kind that comes when you've already accepted every truth worth fearing. "You know what I realized in that storm?" she asked quietly. Holt shook his head. "That you can do everything right and still lose, but that doesn't make it meaningless." She turned to him then, the sunrise beginning to frame her profile. You fight not because you think you'll win. You fight because someone has to hold the line long enough for others to make it home. Holt looked at her for a long time. You really believe that? I lived it, she said simply. The wind tugged at her jacket again, carrying the faint scent of oil and rain. Somewhere down the runway, a motion sensor clicked, and a light flickered on, a single cone of white stretching across the darkness. Alyssa started walking toward it. Holt followed. They reached the end of the runway, where a small memorial stood, a slab of steel with engraved names from Crosswind and a few other missions that had blurred into myth. She avoided this place for years. Her name was on it. She traced the letters slowly with her fingertips. CAPT, Alyssa Reed KIA. Holt watched her silently, unsure whether to speak. Finally, she said, "You ever think about how strange it is to read your own epitaph?" He hesitated. "Can't say I have." "It's humbling," she said softly. "Makes you realize legacy isn't what they write. It's what you leave behind in the people who remember." She stepped back, letting her hand fall to her side. "That night, I thought I was flying my last mission. Turns out I was just flying into another kind of duty." Holt tilted his head. "Which is?" "Teaching others how to survive without losing their humanity," she said. "It's harder than it sounds." They stood in silence again. The first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, catching the edge of the memorial, bathing her name in gold. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Finally, Holt said, "You could have asked for your name to be removed." She shook her head. "No, it belongs there. That's the version of me that saved them. This one," she gestured vaguely to herself, "this one just carries the memory." Holt smiled faintly. "You ever regret coming back?" Alyssa's eyes softened. "Every day I breathe, and every day I don't." It was the kind of answer that didn't need explaining. They stayed there as the sun climbed higher, lighting the airfield in quiet gold. For a moment, the world seemed still. No engines, no orders, just the two of them and the whisper of the sea beyond the fence. Then a young lieutenant approached, early 20s, eyes wide with that nervous mix of awe and respect. "Ma'am," he said, voice tight with formality, "I'm sorry to interrupt, but the new trainees are requesting your presence for the morning briefing." Alyssa turned toward him, studying his expression. He looked barely old enough to shave. She smiled gently. "You're leading them?" "Yes, ma'am." "Then you don't need me. They need you." The young officer hesitated. "With respect, ma'am, they said they'd feel better if you were in the room." Alyssa exchanged a glance with Holt. He smiled. "Looks like you don't have much choice, Captain." She sighed softly. "No one ever does." As they walked back toward the main building, the lieutenant fell a few paces behind. Alyssa's steps were slow but steady, each one carrying the quiet weight of a life reclaimed. At the door, Holt stopped her. "Before you go," he said, "I just want to say—" She cut him off gently. "You already did, Commander, yesterday, with that salute." He nodded. "Then let me say one more thing. Don't disappear again." She smiled faintly. "No promises." He laughed softly. "Fair enough." She stepped into the sunlight, the warmth hitting her face. Inside the operations hall, the chatter quieted as she entered. Dozens of young soldiers turned toward her, some curious, others reverent, all aware. Alyssa moved to the front without a word. She didn't need to introduce herself. They all knew who she was now, or at least, the parts of her story that had survived the retellings. She looked at them, all those faces full of untested courage, and spoke calmly, her voice clear, steady, and low. "Before we begin," she said, "there's something you need to understand about this job. It's not about glory. It's not about recognition. It's about doing what has to be done, even when no one will ever know you did it." The room was silent. Even the hum of the lights seemed to fade. "You'll be forgotten by history," she continued, but you won't be forgotten by those you save, and that's enough." Her gaze swept across the room, faces that would one day stand where she stood, faces that would one day carry her silence forward. "That's how you honor the uniform," she said softly, "not by being remembered, but by being worthy." A stillness filled the room, heavy, sacred. Then she nodded once. "Now," she said, "let's begin." The young officers straightened in their seats. The hum of the screens came alive. And just like that, the room moved again, not out of routine, but out of purpose. Holt watched through the observation glass, a faint smile on his face. In that moment, he realized something. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She was a compass. The story of Viper Falcon would be told and retold in whispers, in mess halls, in late-night barracks conversations. But Alyssa Reed herself would never chase it. Because some stories don't belong to the person who lived them. They belong to the ones who learned from them. The narrator's voice would fade here, calm and reverent. She never asked for forgiveness. She never demanded recognition. She only asked for silence, the kind that follows respect. Alyssa turned one last time toward the window overlooking the airfield. The morning light caught her reflection, splitting it between the woman she was and the legend they'd made of her. For once, she didn't look away. She just stood there, breathing steady, whole. And somewhere outside, across the field where her bird once fell, a faint wind lifted, carrying with it a whisper only she could hear. Viper Falcon cleared for home. She closed her eyes, smiled, and in that moment, without sound, without ceremony, peace finally found her. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.